Thank you all so much for being here on a Monday afternoon. Let me see how far away I should be. And I think, Maggie, this is going to end up being a great order because Maggie gave you a sense of how Education for All is actually working on a daily basis, what's happening in classrooms, how children are moving in and out of the school. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about education policy more generally and try to link it to some of the other MDGs a little bit. We'll see how that goes. So as many of the talks so far in this series have made clear, we are not on track to meet the Millennium Development Goals. But the greatest progress that was made on any of the MDGs was made in education. So I'm going to look a little bit at why that was the case and why this progress is now at risk. And in particular, I'd like to talk about how we might rethink the role of schooling to reach the MDGs and possibly to improve global health and the state of the world more generally. And in order to do that, I'm going to talk about some of the intersections between education MDGs and other MDGs, talk about the way that the education MDG frames the purposes of education, and then talk about possibly a different frame for the education MDGs and the MDGs more generally for social, economic, and ecological justice. So Maggie already went over this. I'll just say very quickly that there are two MDGs that focus on education, MDG 2 and 3. Within the second MDG, net enrollment ratio in primary education, which is what Maggie was talking about, has been the focus. And in MDG 3, the ratio of girls to boys in primary, secondary, and tertiary education has been the focus. So who is targeted by these MDGs? About 10% of the world's population falls into the school age category, but as you saw, that percentage is much higher in many of the world's poorer countries and the countries that are furthest from reaching all of the MDGs. So reaching MDGs 2 and 3 is largely about directly reaching the world's most disenfranchised children in the world's two poorest regions. This is very important because the health MDGs miss kids between 5 and reproductive age, and a lot of the other MDGs that focus on things like wealth creation won't look at kids because of issues around child labor. So the education MDGs are the MDGs that hit this population. It's a big population, and it's growing in a lot of the poorer regions of the world. So there are two kind of rationales for making education available to all. And Maggie hit on this with her focus on universal primary education. The two main rationales are basically that education is a universal human right and it should be provided to all. And the second is this notion of education as human capital development. And those two have come together over the past few decades to really create a very strong focus in the global Education for All movement on child-centered and school-centered education efforts. And that's why actually when we talk about education in the MDGs, we should be talking about schooling, because we've cut out the other types of education that might indeed have huge effects on other MDGs. And part of the reason that we have that focus is because of this effort to divide children's lives from formal labor. And I'm happy to talk about that more later, but it's a division of education versus labor that largely frames this focus on schooling. So what schooling does, or at least is correlated with, is a huge number of issues related to the other MDGs: improved health, productivity, political participation, decreased HIV/AIDS rates, fertility, child mortality. In other words, all of the other Millennium Development Goals, or at least MDGs 1 through 6. So Gakidu et al. In The Lancet provided an example of this type of explanation of the reason for education. They estimated that 51.2% of all averted child deaths between 1970 and 2009 are due to increased education of reproductive age females. And they conclude that, quote, the continued increase in educational attainment, even in some of the poorest countries, suggests that rapid progress in terms of MDG 4 might be possible. So again, it's this notion that education plays this role in kind of providing the base from which all other MDGs can kind of come to fruition. But the mechanisms through which education will do this are quite unclear. So for example, there's an argument made by people like Vander Mutali and Delamanica that education is the only social vaccine that we have for AIDS. And that's because there's a correlation between increased education rates and lowered HIV rates, particularly among girls. But when we actually look at what's happening in classrooms and schools, so when we do what Maggie did and actually pay attention to what's happening, we should be a little concerned about our understanding of why it is that schooling is correlated with increased HIV rates. We think that schooling is doing certain things, but work by people like Vavris, who actually graduated from our own UW-Madison Curriculum and Instruction Program, indicate that education spaces can be as dangerous as they are safe, especially for girls. And we shouldn't just assume that we understand why this correlation exists at the population level. And what that does, I think, is it leads us to the central question of schooling for what? So the way in which education is framed in the Millennium Development Goals, and indeed in most of the international development literature more largely, is that it's a driver for population change. It's basically a black box. You run kids through it and they magically come out a little bit different. And we don't know why. And if we look too closely, we get a little nervous about why. There's also a very strong framing in the Millennium Development Goals and in the international development literature more largely about education as a personal investment. So each individual is responsible for becoming educated and using their education to increase their productivity and to improve their survival capacity. And that's part of the kind of entrepreneurial era in which we live. There's also arguments that have been made about, for example, the role of education in nation building or in creating moral citizens. These discourses are largely absent from the MDGs and from the international development discourse more largely. So we have a very particular framing of education that basically leaves the school box untouched. And that needs to be done because if we look too closely, we start destabilizing our assumptions. Whoops, sorry about that. How do I go? Okay. So I'd like to look now at the fact, you saw Maggie put up some numbers. There was a great deal of progress made towards reaching the education MDGs, particularly the enrollment MDG at first. Why? One thing that we know is that there were some real changes. There were some real changes in what countries were doing, and that was partly because of the World Conference on Education for All in 1990 and the global movement in support of education for all that followed. And the MDGs were able to kind of build on that, as was the case in some other MDGs. One of the things that happened in response to the World Conference on Education for All is that many countries, particularly in Africa and South Asia, many governments actually started investing significant resources into education, and particularly basic education. To give you the example I'm most familiar with, the Malawian government spent over 25% of its entire budget on education following the implementation of the universal primary education. You can't ask a government to do more than that. That's more than perhaps we should ask. And community responses were huge. So you saw the numbers in Uganda, the numbers were similar in Malawi, in Kenya, and many other countries where the government removed school fees and enrollment rates nearly doubled in 6 months. It puts a huge strain on education systems, but the point is that communities said, heck yeah, we will support this, we will send our kids, we are going to get on board in this process. The Global North, on the other hand, which had promised significant resources to any country that agreed to participate in this Education for All movement in a way that they found acceptable, failed. They significantly failed to provide the resources that they said they would provide. And that failure is actually expanding, particularly in the US, which I'm happy to talk about during the question and answer period. So in other words, countries and communities, poor countries and communities responded, and they made huge progress. And that's the progress that we've seen in the MDGs. But wealthy countries did not fulfill their promises, even for the small amount of resources that they said would come the way of governments that implemented these programs. We also know that there are some issues around data. We know that some of the data indicating the improvements that were made are pretty sketchy, and I can give you some examples if anyone is interested in those. But quite beyond the bad data question, we know that there were real changes in the ways that governments and communities were responding. But now progress has stalled. And there's a recognition by the UN organizations that the MDGs, the education MDGs, will be, quote, thwarted by inequality. And those inequalities include inequalities related to gender, class, geography, violence, special needs, and many others. So what is it exactly that happened? We know that the last 10 to 15% of kids, and this is probably true for the other MDGs, here's something I'd love to talk with other folks about. We know that the last 15% of kids are much more expensive to get into school than the first 85%. You get a lot of kids who are kind of held back by school fees or some basic issues. There wasn't a school nearby. And you're able to address those issues by putting in this influx of money for education for all. But then you have the 15% that are just not easy. You have the kids with special needs, you have the kids who are located very far from schools, you have the kids whose parents or communities are very unsupportive of schooling. And getting those kids in school is much harder and it's much more expensive than the other 85%. What that means is that if you want to achieve the education MDG, that last push has to be much bigger than what occurred beforehand. But instead what we've seen is a decrease in the resources available for education at the same time that you have that last hardest to reach population waiting. But quite beyond that last hardest to reach population, there's also been an actual decline in enrollments and completion and in equity rates, as you saw with gender equity in Uganda, including in some of the countries that were the greatest success stories of EFA, like Bangladesh and Malawi, which both reached about 110% gross enrollment rates after some of these policies. And there's been a lot of debate about why we're seeing this actual backtrack from enrollment rates. A lot of arguments are made about backtracking being related to low quality, and it is absolutely evident that many of the schools post-EFA are low quality by any measure. Relatedly, there's been a lot of discussion about funding. Malawi, for example, spends 67 cents per pupil per year on schooling. You just can't do much with 67 cents. Right? And there's some evidence that those issues particularly affect more marginalized kids. So the last kids to enter are often the first to drop out. But it's also pretty clear from a lot of research now that post-school opportunities appear to play a tremendous role in why we're seeing this actual decline in enrollment rates. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the minutes that I have. So I'd like to talk really quickly about a case study in Malawi. I've done about 4 years of ethnographic research in rural Malawi, and I'm happy to talk in more detail about that, but I wanted to give you a couple of examples that I think highlight the dynamic that I think is most important for us to examine. So first, what was happening with high-performing kids when they reached grade 8? This is the end of primary school and the end of free schooling in Malawi. What happened to high-performing girls and high-performing orphan children? These are two target groups in the education MDG. And these were kids who were doing well in school. They had the opportunity to go on to secondary school. They did well enough on their exams to do that. They talked about schooling as being, and I quote, for a brighter future, and about the possibilities that schooling would provide them a way out of the village they were in and the agricultural life that they would lead there, and into urban areas, either in Malawi or in the region or in fact in the world. And they knew that in order to use education for that purpose, they would no longer be able to just have a primary school degree or even a secondary school degree. They would now need probably a university degree and luck, because many university graduates were now coming back and sitting in the village. In fact, we were able to collect really fantastic data because there were so many secondary school and university leavers who were unemployed and sitting in this village. Low-performing girls, on the other hand, said, look, we don't think we're going to make it to secondary school. We don't, we understand what our scores are, but schooling is serving as a protective space for us. As long as we're here in grade 8, we can tell our parents that we can't take on the adult roles that they want for us. We can't work full-time. We can't be responsible for bringing in financial resources for the household. We have to go to school. That's our work. And schooling is much easier than the rest of the work. We see each other. It's nice. It's not as physically difficult. And so some of us are going to try to get our parents to let us repeat grade 8, but we don't think we're going to go to secondary school. It's just that this space is safe. When we went back 10 months later, 10 months after these kids graduated, all of the high-performing boys, orphaned or not, were in secondary school. None of the high-performing girls were. And of the 3 whom we had done the most work with, 2 of them were already pregnant at 15 and 16. The low-performing girls were in the exact same situation as the high-performing girls. So I think that's a pretty clear indication of how it is that schools may actually provide a safe space, particularly for girls. And it's also an indication of how fragile it is. So let's not believe that everything is transformed necessarily by a couple of years of primary schooling. Increased equality in gender and orphan rates, in this community at least, masks who's opting out, why, and when. So here's the other story. Low-performing boys weren't there. And they weren't there because they had dropped out beforehand and they were working. But those economic opportunities were not available for girls in the same way in these communities. And so you're dealing then with the kinds of gendered expectations and possibilities available in school and after school. And this is a very, very complicated issue. What I saw personally was that the link between schooling and the values that students and families held was being corroded. So communities and families wanted kids to go to school so that they would have greater economic opportunity. They didn't want schools to do everything. They wanted schools to get kids out of the village. And schools were not doing that very successfully anymore. And so participation in schools seemed to be increasingly indicating either elite status, where the parents said, go to school as long as you want and we can afford secondary schooling and go on, or desperation. And the kids in the middle were opting out for other options. So a first take on achieving the education MDGs. Internal to the field of education, and these are important questions, I think we need to be asking ourselves questions like, what educational mechanisms can get us closer to achieving the MDGs? How can we leverage previous successes? Because we've had huge successes. How can we link education more clearly to survival mechanisms and make sure that it's supporting children's survival? And education for what? Why are we doing what we're doing? Externally, in relation to other fields, we need to talk about questions like how do we link schooling to other life paths? And what kinds of life paths do we want to help children and families achieve? How do we think about and drive change related to social equity? How do we link learning, which is often quite low in school, to the global challenges that the MDGs help us understand? A second take, however, potentially, is an acknowledgement of the underlying structures that we may need to transform in order to really have any of the effects that we want the education MDGs to have. Escobar, I think, has a really helpful framework of thinking about economy, society, and ecology constantly in relation to each other and often in tension with each other. Such an approach helps us think about how we might integrate cross-sectoral continuities like gender inequity, ecological degradation, the necessity for functioning governance structures and peace, and greater economic equity around the world. And so one of my central questions, and I think a question for very fruitful collaborative research, is can we achieve the MDGs, the education MDGs, but all of the MDGs, without fundamentally rethinking what MDG 8 stands for? And for those of you who don't know MDG 8, there's an absolutely unreadable slide. Basically what MDG 8 says is the global north is not going to do anything about economic redistribution. But you, poor countries, if you do certain things that we consider good governance, we might consider you moving along. That's basically what it says. It basically maintains the global economic order as it is. And there's some really important missing pieces in that, and they include a discussion of the global north's responsibility for what is happening in much of the global south, an examination of the role of non-state institutions and forces. Did you know that 70% of the economic flows in the US are within corporations, transnational corporations? I didn't know that, but that's how GE gets away with not paying any taxes. And it's an indication of some of the issues that we need to start addressing if we want to think about redistributing resources, because resources are not now only or primarily contained by states. And there's a missing piece around the connection between redistribution and equity and global well-being generally. So, I think that schooling for individual survival and entrepreneurship, which is the education MDG model that currently exists, is probably not going to get us to the broader desired MDG outcomes. And therefore, we need to constantly think about the education MDG in relation to these broader economic and social and environmental issues that we face. Having said that, let me say that I do think there are some really interesting models for how schooling, and schools in particular, can serve as hubs for this kind of transformative space, particularly in rural communities where there is not a lot of other infrastructure built up. And so I'd be happy to talk about some of the models that I think are out there for making schools play some very different roles in communities, and from learning from success stories around the world in doing so, including from here in Wisconsin. We have some neat stuff going on here that I think we can build on. But it is absolutely central to recognize that this kind of model, a kind of transformational model that would help us really achieve both the education MDG and all the MDGs, would require significant new resources and collaborations. And that's, I think, where we're held up right now, and I think is the place where this series can be so helpful in moving us forward.